The stagecoach dust had not even settled on the road into Millbrook Crossing when Clara Whitfield first felt the weight of eyes on her back. She had traveled 3 days from Abilene with nothing but a single trunk, a black morning dress she had not yet found the courage to shed, and a small leather purse that held everything she owned in the world. $42, her late husband's pocket watch, and a photograph of a boy she had buried beside his father the winter before. She clutched that purse now the way a drowning woman clutches driftwood, because in truth, it was the only thing keeping her afloat. She had come west because there was nothing left for her in Kansas but grief and a farm that no longer belonged to her once the bank finished with it. Millbrook Crossing was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where nobody knew that Clara Whitfield had once been a wife and a mother, and was now merely a woman alone. She had heard there was work to be had, a seamstress shop needed hands, and the boarding house always wanted help in the kitchen. She told herself that was enough. She told herself a great many things in those days to keep from breaking apart entirely. The town itself was unremarkable in the way so many frontier towns were. A wide dirt street lined with clapboard buildings weathered gray by sun and wind, a saloon whose piano never seemed to stop, a general store with a bell above the door, and a livery at the far end where the smell of hay and horse mingled with wood smoke. Clara stepped down from the stage into the late afternoon heat, and it was there, not 20 steps from the stage office, that trouble found her. He came around the corner of the mercantile so fast she barely had time to turn before his hand closed on the strap of her purse. He was young, younger than she expected trouble to look, with a scarf pulled up over his nose and eyes that darted like a rabbit's. He yanked hard, and Clara, who had spent the last year losing everything she loved without so much as a chance to fight for it, found something in her that refused to lose one more thing. She did not scream. She did not let go. Instead she wrapped both arms around the purse and drove her heel down onto the bandit's boot with every ounce of strength grief had left coiled inside her, and when he grunted and staggered, she swung the purse itself like a weapon, catching him across the jaw. The pocket watch inside cracked hard against bone, and the young man cursed and stumbled back, clutching his face, more startled than hurt. "Give it here, lady, I ain't asking twice," he snarled, drawing a knife from his belt. And that was the moment Clara understood she might have made a fatal mistake, that pride and grief had made her reckless in a town where nobody knew her name and nobody would come running. But someone did come running. He moved like a man who had done this before, closing the distance from the livery in long, unhurried strides that somehow covered ground faster than a run. He was broad through the shoulders, sun-brown from years of open sky, a battered gray hat shading eyes the color of good whiskey, and when he spoke his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to shout to be obeyed. "That's enough now," he said, and the bandit spun toward him, knife still raised, and for one terrible second Clara thought there would be blood in the street that afternoon. But the stranger did not reach for the revolver at his hip. He simply stepped between Clara and the blade as though it were the most natural thing in the world, close enough that the bandit would have to go through him to reach her, and something in his stillness, the utter lack of fear in it, made the younger man's resolve crumble like dry earth. "She ain't worth this," the bandit muttered, more to himself than anyone. And then he was gone, sprinting between the buildings and vanishing into the maze of alleys behind the saloon, leaving only settling dust and Clara's ragged breathing behind. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Clara stood there with her purse crushed against her chest, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, and the stranger simply watched her, as if making sure she was truly unharmed before he trusted himself to look away. "You're bleeding," he said finally, nodding toward her hand, and only then did Clara notice the thin red line across her knuckles where the knife must have grazed her without her even feeling it. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "Wasn't nothing to me, watching it happen," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet, almost wondering, that made her look at him properly for the first time. He had the kind of face that had seen hard years and hadn't let them make him hard in return, weathered but not cruel, tired but not defeated. "Name's Jonah Caro. I run the livery yonder." "Clara Whitfield," she managed, and when he extended his hand to help steady her, she found herself taking it before she had quite decided to. "Well, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and she noted he had seen the ring she still wore, had drawn his own careful conclusions and said nothing more of it. "You fight like a woman who's got something worth fighting for." She almost laughed, a strange broken sound caught somewhere between grief and disbelief. "I've got $42 and my husband's watch. That's the whole of what's worth fighting for these days. Jonah studied her a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he understood exactly the shape of what she carried even though she had told him almost nothing. $42 is $42 more than most folks got when they came through here, he said. And a woman who'll take a knife's edge before she lets go of what's hers, that's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. He walked her to the boarding house himself, though he said it was only because it sat past the livery and he was headed home regardless, and Clara did not argue, because her knees had not entirely stopped trembling and she was grateful, more than she wanted to admit to a stranger, not to be alone with the fright of it. That night, lying in the narrow bed of a room that smelled of lye soap and someone else's memories, Clara found herself thinking not of the bandit's knife but of the stillness in Jonah Caro's eyes when he'd stepped between her and danger, as though her safety had mattered to him before he even knew her name. She told herself it meant nothing. Men on the frontier were often decent in ways that cost them little. A moment's courage, a walk down a dusty street, and decency was not the same as devotion. She had learned, in the hardest year of her life, not to build castles from kindness. And yet sleep, when it finally came, was easier than it had been in months. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Clara had not expected to find so quickly. The seamstress, a sharp-tongued widow named Mrs. Pruitt, hired her on the spot once she saw the fine, even stitches Clara could lay in a hem, and the work, mending trousers, piecing together wedding dresses for other women's happier lives, hemming christening gowns that made her chest ache with a grief she folded carefully away each time, gave her hands something to do besides remember. And nearly every evening, when she walked the short distance from the shop to the boarding house, she found some reason, or he found some reason, for their paths to cross near the livery. At first it was small things. He'd tip his hat and ask after her hand, which healed clean and left only the faintest silver line across her knuckles. Then it became longer, a few minutes leaning against the fence rail while he finished graining the horses, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the price of feed, the newest gossip rippling through Millbrook Crossing. Clara found herself, without quite deciding to, walking a little slower on those evenings, giving herself more time to be delayed. It was on one such evening, nearly a month after the day with the bandit, that Jonah finally asked the question she had been both dreading and hoping for. "You don't talk much about where you come from," he said, watching her rather than the horse he was currently brushing, "or who you lost." Clara's hands stilled on the fence rail. She had known this moment would come eventually, had rehearsed a dozen versions of how she might answer it, and yet standing there in the gold-orange wash of a Kansas, no, a Wyoming, she reminded herself, everything here was different now. Sunset, none of those rehearsed words came to her. "My husband," she said finally, "was a good man. Ezra. We had a farm outside Abilene, and for 4 years it was enough. More than enough. We had a son, too. Thomas. He would have been 6 this spring." Her voice caught, and she made herself keep going, because she had learned that stopping only made the grief harder to pick back up. There was a fever that came through in the fall. It took Thomas first, and then 2 weeks later, it took Ezra too, like he couldn't bear to let our boy go on alone. I buried them both in the same week, under the same cottonwood tree, and then the bank came for the farm because Ezra had never finished paying the note, and there was nothing left for me to fight for. So I came west. Jonah did not offer the empty comfort she had grown so weary of hearing, that they were in a better place, that time healed all wounds, that God had a plan she simply couldn't see yet. He simply set down the brush, came to stand beside her at the fence, and said, "That's about the loneliest kind of hurt there is. Losing a child and a husband both, and having to keep walking anyway." "How would you know that?" she asked, more sharply than she intended, and immediately regretted it. But Jonah only nodded slowly, as though the sharpness hadn't surprised him at all. "Because I buried a wife of my own, 6 years back. Fever took her too, same as your Ezra and your boy. We never had children, tried, but it wasn't meant to be, I suppose. And some nights I think that was its own small mercy, though it didn't feel merciful at the time. I came to Millbrook Crossing because staying in the house we built together was like living inside a grave with the lid left open." Clara looked at him then, truly looked, and understood suddenly why his stillness in the street that day had felt less like courage and more like recognition. He had seen a woman clutching the last of what she had left in the world, and some part of him had known exactly what that felt like, because he had once stood in that same terrible place himself. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For your wife. I'm sorry for your Ezra. And your Thomas," he said, and there was no pity in it, only a shared understanding that settled something in Clara's chest she had not realized was still unsettled. Grief's a strange animal. Folks think it's supposed to get smaller with time, but I've found it mostly just gets quieter. Learns to sit in the corner instead of standing in the doorway. They stood together at the fence a long while after that, saying little else, and yet Clara felt, for the first time since she had buried her family beneath that cottonwood tree, that she was not carrying her grief entirely alone. The weeks that followed deepened into something neither of them named aloud, though the whole of Millbrook Crossing seemed to notice it before they did. Mrs. Pruitt took to teasing Clara about the extra care she put into her hair on the evenings she knew she'd pass the livery, and the boarding house keeper, a kindly woman named Ruth, began setting aside the good preserves for whenever Jonah walked Clara home and lingered on the porch a few minutes longer than propriety strictly allowed. It was not a courtship built on grand declarations. It was built on small things. Jonah fixing the loose step outside the seamstress shop without being asked, Clara mending the collar of his good church shirt when she noticed it fraying, the two of them sitting together at the Sunday social, not dancing, just talking, while the fiddle music spun around them like something neither of them quite belonged to yet but were slowly, carefully, learning the steps of. Clara found herself healing in ways she had not expected. She still thought of Ezra and Thomas every single day. She suspected she always would, that some part of her would carry that cottonwood tree with her always, but the thinking of them no longer felt like drowning. It felt, more and more, like carrying a photograph in a locket rather than a stone in her chest. Then, on a warm evening in early autumn, disaster nearly undid everything. The same bandit who had accosted her that first day, Clara recognized him instantly by the scar that now marked his jaw where the pocket watch had struck him, returned to Millbrook Crossing, this time with two companions and considerably less caution. They struck the bank in broad daylight, and in the chaos of gunfire and screaming horses, it was Jonah who ran toward the danger rather than away from it, because he had seen Clara crossing the street directly into the bandits' path as they fled, her arms full of fabric bolts for Mrs. Pruitt, entirely unaware of the danger bearing down on her. He reached her just as the lead rider's horse reared, and threw himself between Clara and the flailing hooves, taking a glancing blow to the shoulder that spun him hard into the dirt. Clara screamed his name, the first time she had ever said it with that particular note of terror, the same terror she had felt beside a cottonwood tree not so very long ago, and dropped to her knees beside him as the bandits thundered out of town and the sheriff's men gave useless chase. "Jonah," she said, her hands shaking as she pressed them to the wound blooming dark through his shirt. "Jonah, look at me, stay with me." "I'm here," he managed through gritted teeth, and even wounded, even bleeding into the dust of Millbrook Crossing's Main Street, he found the strength to close his hand over hers. "Told you. Wasn't gonna let anything happen to you. Not while I've got breath in me." The doctor said the wound looked worse than it was. A deep gash where the horse's hoof had caught him. No broken bones, no fatal damage, but enough blood loss that he'd need a week's rest and careful tending. Clara did not leave his side for the better part of 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside his bed at the boarding house despite Ruth's gentle protests about propriety, because she had already lost too much to grief's careless cruelty, and she refused with an intensity that surprised even herself, to lose one more person she loved before she had even found the courage to say the word aloud. It was on the third night, with the lamp burning low and Jonah finally strong enough to sit up against his pillows, that he reached for her hand across the narrow gap between chair and bed. "Clara," he said, and something in the way he said her name made her breath catch. "I've been lying here 3 days thinking about the first time I ever saw you, fighting off a man twice your size for a purse with $42 in it, and I keep coming back to the same thought." "What thought is that?" she asked, though her heart already seemed to know. "That I'd marry a woman like you," he said, quiet and certain, the words landing not as a question but as something he had already decided long before he found the courage to say it. "A woman who'll fight for what's hers, even when the whole world's already taken so much from her. A woman who buried her family and still had enough heart left to build something new instead of letting it turn to stone. I've been alone a long time, Clara, telling myself I was content with quiet and horses and an empty house. But since you came to Millbrook Crossing, I don't want quiet anymore. I want you. I want to build something with you. Not to replace what either of us lost, because I don't think that's ever really possible, but to make something new standing right alongside it. Tears rose hot and sudden in Clara's eyes, but for the first time in over a year, they were not tears born purely of grief. "Jonah Caro," she said, her voice trembling, "are you asking me to marry you from a sickbed, half delirious from blood loss? I'm asking you because lying here these 3 nights, watching you refuse to leave my side, I finally understood something I should have said the very first day I met you," he said, and though his shoulder was bandaged and his face still pale from the wound, his eyes held nothing but steady, unwavering certainty. "I don't want to spend one more evening pretending our conversations at that fence are just neighborly kindness. I love you, Clara. I loved you before I let myself admit it, and I'll keep loving you whether you say yes tonight or make me ask you proper once I'm back on my feet. But I'd rather not wait. Life's too short and too uncertain for waiting, and you of all people know that better than most." Clara thought of Ezra, of the cottonwood tree, of the years she had spent believing that love and loss were simply 2 names for the same terrible inevitability. And then she thought of Jonah stepping between her and a knife on her very first day in town, of him throwing himself in front of a rearing horse without a single moment's hesitation, of every small kindness that had slowly, patiently rebuilt something in her she had believed permanently broken. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears, and the sound of it was lighter than anything she had felt in over a year. "Yes, Jonah. I'll marry you." They wed that November, in a small ceremony at the Millbrook Crossing Church with Mrs. Pruitt weeping openly in the front pew and Ruth having insisted on baking 3 separate cakes because she couldn't decide which recipe suited the occasion best. Clara wore blue instead of black for the first time in over a year, and when Jonah lifted her veil and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has waited his whole life to find, she felt the last of the cottonwood tree's shadow finally lift from her shoulders. Not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer heavy enough to bend her. They built their life together at the edge of town, above the livery at first and then, within 2 years, in a proper house Jonah built with his own hands on a small parcel of land he'd been saving toward long before Clara ever arrived in Millbrook Crossing. She kept sewing for Mrs. Pruitt until her hands grew too full with other work, for within 3 years there were 2 children in that house, a girl they named Grace and a boy they named, with Clara's quiet blessing and Jonah's steady understanding, Thomas, so that the name might live on in laughter and childhood rather than only in grief. Clara never forgot Ezra, never stopped visiting the small marker she eventually had placed in the Millbrook Crossing Cemetery in his memory, a stone to stand for the grave she could not visit 2 states away. But she learned, in the years that followed, that love was not a single door that closed forever once walked through, but rather a house with many rooms, each one holding its own memory, its own ache, its own joy, all of them somehow fitting together beneath the same roof. And on quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the Wyoming sky turned that same gold orange it had worn the evening Jonah first told her the loneliest kind of hurt there was, Clara would sit with him on the porch he'd built with his own hands, and she would think of a frightened woman clutching a purse with $42 in it, fighting a stranger in the dusty sea.